Dr. Abigail Favale is Dean of Humanities at George Fox University in Newberg, Oregon. She wrote a memoir about her conversion to Catholicism entitled Into the Deep, an Unlikely Catholic Conversion. And she has a book on gender forthcoming from Ignatius Press. Abigail lives in Oregon with her husband and 4 children. This is a knowHis.love story.
So I grew up as an evangelical Christian, and I don't have a memory before being Christian, right? So my parents would tell me this story about how I was saved when I was 3. My dad was driving with my brother and I, and he pulled over. We said the Jesus salvation prayer. And so there's no pre-Christian era of my life. And I think even as a child, I did have a deep sense, particularly of Jesus's love for me. And that's a gift that I'm very grateful for from my upbringing. But there was a time in my life where I began to question that love and to feel unworthy of that love. And that had a lot to do with what happened when I was a teenager. So, like I said, I grew up evangelical, and I think in that setting, there was a lot of pressure, a lot of emphasis placed on sexual purity. And I think that there's certainly something true about the high regard that Christians have always had for sexuality in terms of its importance and its connection to spirituality and how we should live in harmony with God's design for us. But I think the way that was articulated to me growing up was much more punitive. And there was never really a broader theological understanding of why there were certain rules regarding sexuality. It was very much just, don't do it. If you do, it's the worst thing anyone can ever do, and there's no coming back from it, right? I mean, that was kind of the messaging that I received. I very much had this sense that was like the worst sin. And so as I became an adolescent, started going through puberty and experiencing the very normal experience of increasing sexual desire and curiosity, I felt very dirty about that and very ashamed. And then when I was a teenager and I fell in love for the first time, I had my first boyfriend and fell in love, and then we had sex, and I told my parents about it because I felt bad. The way they responded was just really devastating. And that wounded me in a way that I think I'm still just now in my late 30s beginning to really understand. And so after that pretty traumatic experience of rejection, I mean, I really felt as though I had done the worst thing anyone has ever done, and that there's no coming back from that. I really began to internalize a understanding of myself as damaged goods, as unworthy, and being in the context that I was in, there's no sacrament of confession. There's no kind of formal response of reconciliation, right? So, you're supposed to ask God for forgiveness when you sin, which I'm sure I did, but I never felt whole or healed after that. And I think that experience really gave me a deep felt sense of shame and a lack of belief in my own intrinsic worth. And I think that became a barrier between myself and God in a way. And so in the next kind of phase of my life was very much a phase of gradual distancing from God, pulling away from God. I began to get very angry at God and very angry at the church, at Christianity, because I was in a lot of pain and I had a lot of shame. And so I began to blame Christianity for that shame. But in doing so, I never really healed or resolved it, right? But I really pushed hard away from the church in that time of my life, which was basically my 20s. Yeah, well, at this time of my life as well, I became very interested in feminism. And I think because I felt a deep lack of worth, I was drawn to the message of feminism, which is basically women matter, women have dignity. And so I was seeking after a sense of worth and dignity, I think. And because I had been wounded in a Christian context, I didn't look for healing in Christianity. So I really sought after it in a more secular approach to feminism. And I think I don't know, when I think about that time in my life, I feel as though I was living at two levels. There was like the top level where I was, going to graduate school and really into feminism and feeling a sense of success and energy in my life. But then I think underneath there was this deep well of shame that was still there, that was kind of simmering and then would erupt in odd moments when I would least expect it. And also this sense of hollowness and emptiness to what I was doing. And I think because I was really just pushing myself and busy and distracted, most of the time I was able to ignore that. But then there would be moments where I would be sort of confronted with myself and with the emptiness and the unresolved pain that was still under the surface. Because I was basically running from Christianity because I was in pain, but that wasn't resolving my pain. It was just burying it. It was just kind of pushing it down. Well, it's hard to pick one single moment because it was like this dizzying cyclone of moments over a period of a couple of years. But the beginning was being pretty radically pushed into the Catholic Church, which I can only really, and by pushed, I don't mean like in a bad way. I mean, I had reached this point where that spiritual crisis that was sort of simmering underneath came to a boiling point. And in that moment, I think God hit me with an arrow of grace and I became very suddenly Catholic. And so that was the beginning, I think, of learning to experience God's love once again. It didn't happen right away. But when I became Catholic and began to be ministered to by the sacraments, that really began to affect an internal change and an internal healing process. So the Eucharist and also confession were incredibly important in learning how to experience God's love. I had this wasn't my first confession as a Catholic, but this was a couple of years in, because I had never done a full general confession, even after I'd been Catholic for a couple of years. And I decided to do one, and I prepared for several days. I made lists of things I could remember. And I went into the confessional very determined, like I'm just going to confess everything. And we just got a new priest. And so this is my first time with this new priest, right? And here I am like throwing open the closet doors and letting all my skeletons out. And And I think that confession lasted for over an hour, and I wept and just laid it all bare. And that was an incredibly healing experience that I still just kind of marvel at. And I also think the Eucharist has always been perhaps a place where I experience God's love. I mean, not always in an emotional way, right? Sometimes you go to Mass and you're distracted, it's boring, the kids are being crazy, you don't feel all blissed out. But nonetheless, even in those moments, Christ meets me exactly where I am, and in this tangible, bodily, humble way. And that never ceases to amaze and move me. And I think one of the consequences of my sense of shame and lack of worth, the way I responded to that is a belief of I have to prove my own worth. I have to do something to earn love. I have to do something to be worthy of love. And the wonderful thing about the Mass and the Eucharist is you just show up and receive. There's a sense in which I participate in the liturgy, but Christ doesn't offer himself to me because I've achieved something amazing that day. But he meets me exactly where I am. And so I think for me, the challenge is always, I'm always trying, I think, to be too busy and distracted. And so when I'm able to stop doing and simply to be, that's when I really experience God's love. Even though that's a hard lesson for me to learn, and I'm still learning it. Yeah, I feel like that's something I'm still also learning. So I was baptized when I was 8 in a very muddy creek in southern Utah. The picture that we have after my baptism, I'm coming out of the water and I look like I've been drenched in chocolate milk. But I remember that day very vividly, even though I did not have at the time the theology to understand what was going on. I mean, it was very much presented to me as, an outward declaration of faith, a profession of faith, rather than something that God was doing in a very real way in my soul. But that my lack of understanding doesn't mean that it wasn't happening, because it really was happening. And even now, even at the time, it felt like such an important moment. And I will always remember it very clearly. But when I was becoming Catholic, there was a part of me that wanted to get rebaptized, because I was like, oh, but now I get it. So let's do it again. But of course, I didn't need to. So in some ways, it's the promise of my baptism, even though it's been present and that grace has been working in my life all along, I'm now becoming attentive to it in a way. And that's one thing it's been so hard in this pandemic not to have that very simple mark of baptism with the holy water going into church, right? I've missed that, because that would be a moment where, and sometimes I would do it automatically and not think about it, but that would be a moment when I would try dipping my fingers in the water and making the sign of the cross to recall what you're describing, that I have been baptized. I'm a beloved daughter of God. And that kind of physical, tangible sign of that, when I'm attentive to that, and that's what's so beautiful about the sacraments and sacramentals like that, because I think because they're bodily, they are able to get our attention in a way that just intellectual ideas or homilies, those things don't always get our attention in the way that water on your hand does, or wine down your throat does. Like those sort of bodily signs are so important. Wow, I love this. So there are moments, I think, when God shows off a little bit, when he will pull back the curtain to show to us the kind of action that's always happening behind the scenes that we're often not aware of. And I think a primary way he does this is through prayer. He will move us to pray for something that he already intends to give us. But by moving us to pray for it, then we're invested, our attention is on it. He's going to be putting on a show for us, and he wants to make sure we're looking in the right direction. And I think he'll use prayer that way. And so there have been some pretty incredible answers to prayer that I've experienced. And also not just prayer, but prayer that's offered with suffering. So to give one specific example, when I was pregnant with my third child, I have four children. I actually have five if you include one that we lost. But I have four living children. And when I was pregnant with my third, this was after I'd become Catholic, and I was really leaning into this idea of offering up suffering for the first time. And so I had three intentions it's always helpful to have three. I don't know why. I had three intentions in my mind, and that throughout my pregnancy, I was offering up the suffering of my pregnancy for those three intentions. And then also all the suffering of the birth for those three intentions. And one of them was for healing for a relative who was struggling with addiction and homeless at the time. The second one was for my grandfather who was dying and was thinking of taking his own life. And then the third one was for my husband's conversion to the Catholic faith. And those are all three, those are like heavy hitting prayer requests, right? I mean, those are pretty big. But by the end all three of them were answered. So that relative, by the end of the year, he had moved to a new state. He had gotten a job. He was clean. He's still clean, completely turned his life around. The second one, my grandfather died a natural death, even though it involved a lot of suffering. And my husband has since become Catholic. So I feel like that was a sense that God was really showing off. And I specifically entrusted those three requests to Mary. So that's another way I think God has shown his love for me, is through his gift of Mary in my life. Because I have some mother wounds in my history, and I didn't know before I became Catholic how important it would be to have Mary as my mother, and how important that would be for my own healing. And so that's perhaps the primary way that he shows his love, is through the gift of Mary. I guess I would want to say that you are loved more than you can possibly imagine, and that you are always in every moment being held into existence by a God that loves you, that dreamed you up, and that is always singing the song of your being. And there's nothing you can do to lose that love. There's nothing you can do to lose the infinite worth and dignity that is given to you by that love. No one is damaged goods. And the purpose that you were designed for is to be loved and to love in return. And so if you can trust in and open yourself to that love, and let it change you, then you should.
Thank you for listening to Dr. Favale's story. I would love to share your story as well. Please connect with us on social media or by clicking on the Join Us link at knowHis.love.